Is it possible to mistake a decades-old haunting for a large, lively party of living people? Would you be able to tell the difference, especially as a 4-year-old boy? I'm Mr. Ominous.
And I'm Dr. Grimm, covering shocking histories
and darkest mystery.
From the undeniable facts
to personal experience, our channel covers all things ominous
and grim.
James lived on Lonsdale Street in a very small South Carolina community. The branches of very tall oak trees hung over the street, turning it into a shady tunnel during the summer. James looked forward to the day when his dad would take the training wheels off of his bike. That day, he could ride unassisted down Lonsdale Street with the other and even bigger kids. It was the early 1960s. President Kennedy smiled his big, toothy grin at his audience from their black and white TV sets, and NASA had yet to land on the moon. Local teens loved dancing to the Watusi and the twist. Women of all ages wore the popular beehive hairstyle and pale lipstick. Cars built long and low cruised up and down Lonsdale Street on a daily basis. Meanwhile, a tiny boy named James, 4 years old, played almost every day in the well-kept yard of his parents' small but cozy ranch-style home, until his mom would call him inside to eat his lunch or dinner. James had a much older brother in college, and a younger brother that was just a small infant. His father worked in an office job, and his mother was a stay-at-home mom. Since he could barely toddle, James developed a lot of curiosity about the big house across the street from him. The big house looked different from all the other houses. It was much larger and much more grand, but it was the most shabby as well. For some reason, no one ever cut the grass in the front yard or trimmed back the overgrown shrubs. James always wondered about that. Lawnmowers seemed to hum around all summer, keeping the other lawns in the neighborhood neatly trimmed. Why not at the big house? However, plenty of activity went on in the house at all hours of the day and the night. Many times, James would wake from sleep by loud and lively music, especially on warm summer nights, or around the holidays, or when the moon shone full and bright. He would climb out of bed and push aside the window curtains to get a peek at what went on across the street. Sometimes he would slowly push open the window so he could hear better, even though he had to stand on his chair to do so. Bright light blazed from the windows of the house, and he could hear people laughing and talking. Through the large windows he saw people drinking, eating, and dancing. Not dancing like the teenagers doing the Watusi or the twist at the local soda shop either. The people at the house across the street danced in a strange way James had never seen, slapping their knees and throwing their hands over their head. He would watch the dancing couples for a while. Then the clock in the hall would chime 3 o'clock in the morning. Even James, at the age of 4, knew parties in this small town did not last until 3 o'clock in the morning, especially on a Wednesday night. If you're a fan of shocking histories and dark mystery, find our next episode on your platform by following this podcast, sharing this episode with your friends, and giving us a review. Join our community of avid listeners at ominousandgrim.com for bonus content and benefits. That's OMINOUSANDGRYMM.com. And now, back to our story. After the clock chimes, James usually yawned widely. Then he crawled back into the bed and tried to ignore the music. Finally, he would drift back to sleep. The next morning, he didn't play with all the expensive toys his grandparents had bought him. He just stood in the chair and stared across the street at that house. He wondered what all happened at that party last night. He wondered what time the party finally ended. He remembered how pretty the women looked in their filmy dresses that sparkled, and their short hair worn with headbands and feathers. Some wore coats of fur or beautiful velvet in gorgeous colors. He wished his mom would dress like that. He wished she had a velvet coat with sparkly buttons and feathers in her hair. Instead, she usually wore calf-length short pants, called pedal pushers at the time, and a plain blouse of one pale color or another. None of those bright colors. James's mom also covered her hair with a printed scarf during the day. It hid the bristly curlers she wore in her hair until her husband came home. But even the men at that party across the street looked as elegant as the women, with fancy double-breasted suits, heavy gold watch chains, and hats with shiny headbands. James admired them very much. He especially liked the white straw hats the men wore in the summer, and the way some of the men posed with decorative canes. He wished his dad had one too, as well as a fancy straw hat. The people that lived in the house next door also owned a beautiful jet black cat. Sometimes James saw the kitty sitting in one of the windows. It had a big blue bow tied around its neck. James wished he had a cat like that for a pet. During the day, people came and went from the house, and James watched them from his front yard. On winter days, he would occasionally peek through the windows of his house to see what was going on across the street. Sometimes his mother questioned him about why he sat on the front lawn and, quote, stared off into space. He just shrugged his shoulders. He didn't want to talk about the parties at the big house. James thought his mother might forbid him from watching the partygoers, as she guessed. One late spring afternoon, just before sunset, he saw many people come and go from the house. But this time, they were all dressed in black clothing. The men kept their heads bowed down, and the women wore thin black veils that draped over their faces. Some ladies held dainty lace handkerchiefs to their face, as if they had been crying. A big wreath of pale lilies and ferns hung on the front door of the big house. A bow of black ribbon hung from the wreath. James noticed no one laughed at the house across the street that day. He watched the men in a tight knot, talking on the lawn. Every so often they passed around a paper bag with a bottle in it. Each man took a long swig from the bottle and passed it on to the next man. James crouched behind a bush in his front yard and watched the people for what seemed like hours. He watched until his mom called him in to eat his favorite evening meal of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Seeing the people all dressed in black made him feel depressed for the rest of the evening. He didn't eat much of his dinner. "James, are you sick?" his mother asked anxiously. She put her hand on his forehead. "You have no fever," she said after a moment. Seasons passed, and then a couple years. James grew taller and bigger. Finally, his dad took the training wheels off of his bike. Then his mom allowed him to venture out of the front yard, alone. He felt very grown up. Now James could ride up and down Lonsdale Street with the other and even bigger kids, even with the older ones that called him the little kid. Now, James didn't have so much time to watch the people coming and going from the house across the street. And when the loud music played at night, he slept right through it all. He had become so accustomed to hearing the lively tunes by this time, he no longer paid any attention. One day, he happened to mention all the people that came and went from the house across the street to one of his friends. They stood in James's front yard, looking at the house. "You mean that house?" asked his new friend Bobby. He pointed to the house. "Yes, that's it." "But nobody lives there." Bobby spoke carelessly. He poked at a large spider web, spun over a nearby bush with a stick. "That house has been empty for years. It's a ruin inside. My older brother says it's haunted too." Deep shock reflected on James's pale face. He turned to stare at his friend. "How does your brother know how it looks on the inside?" "He's been in there, dummy. He knows what it looks like, because he's gone in there several times and has seen it himself." "But what about the people that all live there, and the people that come to the parties?" "Parties?" Bobby squinted in the bright sunshine. "There ain't no parties there. Because nobody's lived there. Crazy or something? Suddenly, James felt as if he couldn't breathe, as if all the light went out of the sun and he stood in icy coldness, tightly clutching the handlebars of his bike. Nobody lives there, I'm telling you, Bobby kept insisting. What are you talking about? Nobody lives in that beat-up old house, except a bunch of stupid ghosted bugs. James clenched his teeth, so tight, the muscles twitched in his jaw. The landscape swam dizzily in front of him. He couldn't immediately process all of the new and startling information Bobby gave him. James knew what he had seen at the house across the street. It was so real. So how come this kid had no idea? It suddenly dawned on James that maybe not everyone saw the parties across the street like he did. Maybe Bobby and his big brother didn't see the people in their fancy clothes and all the dancing. They didn't hear the music or the laughter. However, James certainly didn't want his new friend to ridicule him for what he saw. And what if he told all the other boys and they made fun of him? He would lose all of his friends. I was just joking, James murmured quietly and turned away to inspect the rear wheel tire on his bike. Bobby immediately lost interest in the haunted house. Hey, you want to ride down to Charlie's? I heard he's got a new chemistry set and one of those weird-looking fake shrunken head things, like they have in all the magazines. Okay, James agreed, much relieved. Time continued to pass. James now knew to never mention the noisy parties at the old house and all the laughing people dressed in elegant clothes. He tried to forget the hours he's watched all the rowdy activity at the house across the street, so absorbed that he didn't even play with his own toys. He tried very hard not to pay attention to the things going on in the old house. He felt a deep embarrassment that no one else seemed to see or hear the things that he did. So he tried very hard to ignore the house and the loud music, until one dusty summer's day, another friend named Sam suggested they walk across the street to take a look at that old place. Reluctantly, James followed his friend across the hot asphalt street. They stood in the long grass at the edge of the ruined lawn and stared at the front of the house. Up close, James noticed most of the glass panes of the windows had been smashed. He looked away. He hated seeing the house looking so shabby, so dilapidated. Somehow, the yard and the house didn't look that bad from James's front yard. Or was that just another one of his illusions? Let's go inside, Sam spoke with encouragement, like he felt James' hesitation and wanted to help him overcome it. Okay, James said slowly. He felt as if he were betraying an old friend by going across the street. You've never been inside this house before, have you? Sam asked. Even though you live exactly right across the street? Yeah, I know. I just never felt like going inside. I just watched the people coming out and going inside. He thought to himself, I like seeing them, and I didn't want to intrude. Look at all those bees buzzing around that chimney. Bet there's a giant nest inside, Sam said with a grin. James stared at the rotting molding around the smashed-out windows, at the thick covering of ivy on the stone front. With great sadness, James remembered the beautiful piano music that drifted from the house on moonlit evenings, and how happy it made him, especially when he was younger. A huge lump rose in his throat and he coughed. Let's go inside, Sam urged again. So for the first time ever, James walked inside of the house across the street. Someone had snatched off the front door a long time ago. A broken hinge still clung crookedly to the splintered wood of the door frame. Cobwebs hung thick from the molded ceiling, and piles of trash littered the floor. James glanced around, but he didn't see a piano. See those old bottles? Sam pointed to a dusty pile. That's from the old winos and bums that come here to get drunk when no one's looking. Winos and bums? James sighed as he stared around him. Years of damp and neglect had ruined the walls. A cluster of dark black mold grew in one corner of the front room. Large splinters of the broken stair banister lay scattered across the floor. The boys stepped over them. Somewhere he heard rustling and the squeak of a mouse, or maybe more than one. James felt like groaning, but he didn't. He didn't want Sam to know how it hurt him to see the broken down inside of the house, to see the gaping holes in the ceiling where chandeliers had been torn away and stolen, the huge cracks that had opened up in the walls. It hurt him deeply, and in a way he couldn't even begin to explain. The lump in his throat grew bigger and even more painful. Obviously, the house hadn't been lived in for many years, even decades. James stared around him in disbelief. Is this where all those people danced and laughed during their loud parties at night? He wondered. Broken tile, mixed with glass bits, crunched under his feet as he walked around. Where were those happy, beautifully dressed people now? This old place is haunted, announced Sam. Everyone in town says so, even my grandma, and she doesn't even believe in ghosts. Haunted? Ghosts? The party people had to be ghosts. He had been watching a party of ghosts all of those years, listening to ghostly music, and he honestly believed they had been real. How could he have been so stupid? Let's get out of here, he said to Sam. Mom just baked some cookies and we can have some with a glass of milk. Sam, of course, agreed. That night, after dinner, James bombarded his dad with questions about the old house. When was it built? Who lived there? Why was it empty now? Well, most of these houses around here were built after the First World War, son, his dad said. He lowered the paper he'd been reading, and that house in particular was a lot bigger and fancier than the rest in this neighborhood. Who lived there? James asked. A family that owned several of the factories in the valley. They were very rich. Still are, I suppose, wherever they went. He shook his paper and folded it. Did the family have any kids? James asked. My grandpa told me an old sweetheart of his once lived there. Very pretty girl named Maddie. Tall and slender. She was one of those flappers, I suppose. Well, what happened to her, Dad? Well, she died, son, when she was very, very young. How? James persisted. Well, there was a prohibition back then, and young Maddie loved parties and dancing more than she loved to breathe. My grandpa said she'd stayed up all night drinking bootleg whiskey and dancing to Charleston, the foxtrot, and the shimmy until dawn. Some of the whiskey she drank was bad, though. Poisonous. It made her very sick, and she died at 3 o'clock in the morning, right in the middle of one of those parties. She died? What happened then? James, my grandpa told me that her parents just moved away and left the place. They couldn't bear living in the same house where their daughter died. Nobody has lived there at all since she died? James asked. Sure, the house was rented out a few times, but for some reason no one ever could stay there for long. The old house has stood empty now for over 30 years. There's even talk of having the old place torn down. Empty for 30 years. The house had been empty long before he had even been born. James shivered. Now he had undeniable proof that all those late-night parties, the crazy music, the wild dancing, the people were all nothing but spirits and ghosts of days gone by. Apparitions of memories. And he had watched them with such curiosity, admired their elegant clothes, and listened to the jazzy music as far back into his childhood as he could remember, and they were all nothing but a bunch of rowdy ghosts, drinking and dancing and having a great time. If you've enjoyed this episode of Ominous and Grim and want more shocking histories and dark mystery, don't forget to follow this podcast, share this episode to your friends, and review us on your favorite platform. Finally, sign up at ominousandgrim.com for members-only benefits. That's OMINOUSAND GRYMM.com. And until next episode, don't look behind you.